Hey everybody, Brendan here. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing Touch Grass Tuesdays, where I analyze a game outside. Now, why did I come up with this? I'm not sure. Maybe I have issues because I am freezing cold right now, sitting in the snow. But hey, why not? So, as you can see, it's snowing quite heavily where I am in Canada. Let's get into the game. So I was playing against a Fide Master online a little bit ago, and we had an interesting opening trap that occurred. All right, so here's how the game went. E4, C5, we got a Sicilian, knight to F3, and my opponent played E6, which is something I've been struggling a lot with lately, but it was definitely something that was what I was working on at the time. It's definitely probably still one of the weakest parts of my repertoire, but here we got a pretty interesting game. I played d4, going into an open Sicilian. They ended up taking the pawn. Of course, I recaptured. There's not really another move here. And then my opponent played a6, which is the con variation of the open Sicilian. So there's a few ways to play. You can play something like knight c3, bishop e3. Honestly, most variations aren't really tempting to me, except for one, and that's the move c4. So the c4 is going for a Maroczy bind setup in the center, and I feel like it's a really good way to try to fight for an advantage here. So after after c4, my opponent played queen to c7, which is a very normal move in these types of positions. I played knight to c3, knight to f6, which is attacking the e4 pawn, so I got to be aware of that. And then I played the move queen to d3, which was kind of inviting a little trap here. So the trap involves bishop to b4, which was played, and then the move a3. So what's the idea behind a3? The idea is trying to coerce them into taking on c3, getting rid of their dark square bishop, and as we can see, they have a lot of dark squares that are weak because they're not controlled by pawns. So, therefore, if they do not keep the bishop, they could run into some problems. For example, imagine this bishop's gone and we get a knight to d6. There's a lot of lines like that where it just ends up winning for white. So, of course, this variation, they're tempted to take on c3, but the reason why they did is because they think that we have to take with the pawn. That's not actually the truth here, though. If we have to take with the pawn, this is not a tempting variation. Our c pawns are doubled and weak on a semi-open file. They can bring a rook to the c file in the future, and they definitely have compensation for giving up their dark-squared bishop. But the truth is, we can actually take with the queen. Why does it look like we can't? Well, it's because e4 is hanging. And this is exactly what my opponent did in the game. They ended up taking on e4, which is a grave mistake. But this move is very difficult to spot. However, there is a winning move in this position for white, and it's a very deep one. Now, I did not come up with this on my own. This is actually from a book I read. Shout out to Gregors Gajewski, who is a very, very strong grandmaster, and a lot of respect for him and his opening preparation. So in this position, we actually have the brilliant knight to b5. So the idea of knight to b5 is that our queen is hanging, but we're attacking their queen as a result. And since they took on e4, they're no longer covering g7 as well. Like if the knight was back on f6 here, this move wouldn't make sense because we can't take on g7 at the end. So the problem here is if they end up taking our queen, we take their queen with interest. After knight takes c7, we're also attacking their rook in the corner. And unfortunately, they're going to be losing an exchange and maybe even more. And the knight does have a way out, so they're not going to be able to keep the piece. So that's not really the critical variation of this position. The critical variation here is what if they end up taking the knight? But this actually runs into problems. After a takes b5, we now take on g7, attacking their rook in the corner. There's only one logical move, and that's to defend their rook by playing rook to f8. And now we play bishop h6, adding pressure by attacking the f8 rook. Now there's two responses here, and both have the same idea. Right now, their rook is threatened with checkmate, and they have to defend it. So there's queen to d6, which is played in the game, and we'll get to that. But there's also queen to c5, which I think deserves to be looked at. And there's a funny move here. The move f3. And all of a sudden, where is this knight going to go? There's not really a good square. If they go back to f6, we can just take that knight, and, well, we regained our material with interest because they don't have a safe area for their king. However, we have to ask, what about, first off, knight d6, there's queen takes f8 with checkmate. But what about knight to f2 attacking the rook in the corner, right? It is defended by the queen. But now here comes our special move, b4. And now after b4, they have to move their queen either to d6 or e7 to defend f8, but they're losing their knight afterwards. So, for example, if queen d6, we can now just take the knight freely. We've regained our material, and we have an attack. We can take on f8, for example, if we want to next. That looks like a winning idea that we can definitely play. We can also do other things like develop our bishop, and we should be winning like that as well. So, okay, that's not really an option for them. So, instead, what if they play queen to d6 here, right? Queen to d6 is the more natural move because, well, f2 isn't really threatened. I guess one other thing I should mention is if f3, queen, f2 check, it actually just loses the game on the spot to king d1. There's no checkmate because of the bishop on h6. And now their queen has to move somewhere, or their knight, and they'll be checkmated on f8 in short order. So, after queen to c5, let's just move back here. Queen to d6. And again, remember that d2 is actually covered by our bishop on h6, so we don't have to worry there. Instead, in this position, we can play a really surprising move, and that's c takes b5. And they don't really have a way to deal with all of the threats to their king, as well as to the bishop on c8. Here's a funny variation here. If b6, preparing to meet rook c7 with bishop b7, we actually have rook c1, bishop b7, and rook to c7. And the thing is, they can't actually take our rook because the problem is f8 will be checkmate if they move their queen off of the diagonal. So they'd have to play something really awkward, like rook to a7, but now we can just develop naturally. Moves like bishop to d3 look okay, and they can't do anything. The bishop isn't even being attacked because if they end up taking it, well, then we have f8 with checkmate again. So that's a huge issue for them. So let's move back here, all the way back to this position, where I ended up taking on b5. After a takes b5 here, my opponent ended up playing the move queen to e7. And after queen to e7, I play rook to c1, and again we're seeing the issues with the fact that this bishop is extremely weak on c8. So my opponent plays knight to d6. This was their idea, to cover the bishop. But now I play bishop to d3, just developing, preparing to castle. And my opponent's up a piece, but is one of these pieces supposed to be an extra piece? It doesn't really look like it, right? These pieces feel quite weak. This also helps prevent anything like knight to f5, as we can just take that off the board, and then c8 will be threatened. For example, knight to f5, we can take and take with check. We just go king f1, and good luck defending this guy and the f8 rook. Right? It's not really possible. If they move the knight, we just take it. So that would be a free piece. So they don't end up doing that, of course. But I do play bishop to d3. Now my opponent plays the move b6 in order to prepare something like bishop to b7. But now I have a funny looking move, bishop to e4. And bishop to e4 causes problems because, well, they can't take it again. If they end up taking, we take on c8. So if knight takes e4, rook takes c8 here, the queen will have to block, and we can take on f8 with checkmate. And they don't really have a comfortable square for their rook. For example, rook a7 was played in the game, but we're going to still run into issues. I ended up just castling here. This feels like a very safe move. And the game's almost over already, because one of my threats here is rook d1, taking this knight, and then c8's no longer defended. There's not really a good way to cover c8. And the idea, again, behind this bishop on e4 is if they ever bring their bishop here, we can end up taking it, where whenever they take back, we still have this rook c8 check, which will win the game. So In this position, after rook a7 and castles, my opponent ended up playing bishop to b7, but I ended up taking the piece, and after rook takes b7, rook fd1 just straight up wins the game. There's not really a way to prevent rook c8 check or rook takes d6. Rook takes d6 is our first move here that we're going to play, because again, the threat, rook takes d6. If the queen captures, rook c8 check. I'll just show that on the board, why not, doesn't hurt. Rook takes d6, queen takes d6, rook c8 check, king e7, and now they're blocking their access to f8. We can end up taking the rook on f8 here and winning the queen right after that, as the king has to go to f6. We could probably even try checkmating here, but this is good enough. All right, so in this position, instead, what happened was rook fd1, knight to d6. My opponent played the move knight to c6, trying to cover things, but if you have to play a move like knight to c6 and give back the piece like this, the game's kind of over. So b takes c6, d takes c6, and finally, after d takes c6, we can finally cash in on f8 and take this piece, so they'll recapture, and then we end up taking. Where after king takes f8, we can play the move rook takes d6, we're up a rook, and we're going to win the game. And in this position, my opponent ended up resigning. So yeah, I thought this was a really interesting game just because it shows that sometimes all you need is good opening prep. That's actually a joke. But it's good to know that even FMs are capable of missing opening traps like this. This is actually in the master database, I think about like 50 times, and more than half the times, masters actually fall for this trap. It's surprising that knight to b5 is able to be played so many times, but hey, it's a difficult move to see, and it does highlight the weaknesses of the dark squares. And if you're not careful with the dark squares in these types of Sicilians, you can just end up losing the game. That's about it. Hopefully the analysis was okay. I am freezing cold, sitting down in the snow. I'm gonna be very, very cold when I leave, but I hope you enjoyed something a little different, and yeah, maybe we'll continue this if you guys enjoy it. So I will see you in the next video. Have a good one, guys, and thanks for watching. Bye-bye.